We've been working through a lot of these review ideas from micro, thinking about market structure and different kinds of situations where we might observe a monopoly. We had talked about, how there might be a natural monopoly. Talk about how, the post office, whether that is a natural monopoly or not. We talked about maybe concrete production in a particular area, in a geographic region, that might be a natural monopoly, but on a national scale, probably not. Now, concrete companies actually have been charged with antitrust violations in the past. Interestingly, because concrete production could be a natural monopoly, in some places in the past, the concrete companies that exist have been closely connected to the mob. Now, if you happen to be in the mob, it might be nice to have close connections to the concrete company. After all, if you need to wax somebody and hide them, being able to pour an entire slab of concrete over the top of that person, that might be, helpful. So there's connections there, but it's because concrete tends towards a natural monopoly within a geographic region that we tend to see those kinds of connections. Okay. What about electricians' services? Are those a natural monopoly? We might think that an electrician would be a very competitive marketplace. Actually, I think that within Muncie, it's under competitive. There's not enough electricians. So for me, for getting my house renovated so that I can finally move into it has been a struggle, because finding an electrician who can get the job done quickly has been difficult. Right? So there might not be enough electricians, which is to say that those electricians that do exist within Muncie can charge above market prices, or work at their own damn pace, right? Coming along quite slowly, it is. So they don't face fierce competition, so they can go slower. What about hair braiding services? Is that a natural monopoly? No. How can you tell it's not a natural monopoly? Well, because you have to get a license to be a hair braider. You have to get a license, then it's not a natural monopoly, it's an artificial monopoly. Right? Wherever there is, John Hassness, a law professor at Georgetown, likes to say that he has this thing called Hassness law. And that law, roughly stated, is that to understand how markets work, look at legislation. To understand how markets work, look at legislation, because legislation only intervenes in order to do something that the market isn't doing by itself. So we would expect that the market for hair braiding is rather competitive if it's left alone to the market, but it becomes somewhat more monopolistic because you have to get a license to do that job. So it's the government intervention that makes that market less competitive. Another approach or way to have a monopoly is to have a market franchise. This is an agreement entered into by the government and a business firm where the government authorities legally allow only that one business to operate. So, for example, until recently, taxi cabs didn't have any competition within a city. The government would award or sell medallions to particular taxi cab drivers or companies, and then those companies had exclusive license to operate taxi cabs within the city. The objective was to eliminate jitney services. A jitney service is just some dude in his car driving around asking people if they want to ride. All right, no regulation, no oversight at all. Now, back in the day, jitney service would be reasonably expected to be a little bit more dangerous than a regulated taxi cab service, because there were not effective ways to monitor or discipline the behavior of those jitney services. You get in, and if the guy treats you badly, takes you for a ride, so to speak, you have no recourse. There's no way of finding out who that guy was. So having a taxi cab service might help to provide, that's regulated, might help to provide some safety. You can actually increase the demand for that market. But today we have, of course, Uber and Lyft. Now, how many of you have used Uber? Okay, good. Every semester, it gets to be more and more students. I've used Uber a lot, actually. I drove for Uber for a while when I lived in Washington, D.C. I picked up about one economist a day, driving around Washington, D.C. Let's see now. How many of you were freshmen the year that, fine, none of you, or were students here the year that are not given here that came to speak, and Ball State freshmen read the real American, or the true American? No, okay. Anyway, I gave him a ride once in my Uber. He's this silver-haired guy from New Jersey with an Indian heritage that is on the morning Joe all the time. I broadly disagree with him on the ground. In general, any seller that faces a negatively sloped demand curve is considered a monopolist. A monopolist is not a price taker, but instead a price searcher. The monopolist searches for the profit maximizing price. So the objective is still the same, to profit maximize, but the firm that has some search capabilities with respect to price will search for not only the profit maximizing quantity, but also the profit maximizing price. And they have to do that in combination. We can classify monopolies into two forms: open or closed. An open monopoly is any seller that faces a downward sloping demand curve in a market that is open to entry by any potential competitors. So it's open, it's a monopoly, right, because it's facing a downward sloping demand curve, and it's open because it faces potential competition from other competitors. A closed monopoly is a seller that faces a negatively sloping demand curve, but is protected from other competitors by the market, by the government. For example, medical doctors are a closed monopoly. What do you mean, Snow, that the doctors are a closed market? Well, how many people are there that are doctors, and who determines how many people can go to medical school? The medical bar determines the number of spaces that are available at medical schools. And many doctors have an incentive to limit the number of new doctors that enter into the market. Many have said that we are actually experiencing a shortage of doctors right now. And part of that reason is that, well, doctors have an incentive to limit the number of other doctors that there are. Doctors also have a lot of incentives to determine how often you go to the doctor. So how many times a year do you go to the dentist to get your teeth cleaned? Typically 2 times a year, right? The insurance will cover 2 cleanings a year. Whenever I go to the dentist, I always ask them, they want to say, okay, we need to set up another appointment in 6 months, right? I always say, oh, I'm busy that month. And so then I set it up for the 7th month. And then when that appointment is coming up, I always say, actually, can we push it back another month? Right? And I always try to go 8 or 9 months between cleanings. Because I like dirty teeth? No, but because it turns out you don't need to go to the dentist that often, right? You don't. You go to a heart doctor, and he says, okay, I'd like to see you again in 3 weeks. Why does he want to see you again in 3 weeks? So he can bill you for your insurance company, right? Well, if he had a full load of clients, he would not be asking you to come back in 3 weeks. He might be suggesting that you come back in 4 weeks or 5 weeks. The amount of other clients that he has, or patients that he has, is partially determined of how often he asks you to come back. I'm not saying that doctors are wicked or evil. I'm saying they're people just like us. They're people just like, they face the same sorts of incentives that the rest of us face. Similarly, for law schools, right? How many students are admitted into law schools is in part determined by the bar, by lawyers. And then when you take the bar exam, it's not like you have to hit a certain score to pass the bar. No, every year, everybody who takes the bar, does their best to pass it, but the bar committee decides how many students they want to let in. Right, so it's as if I were to say at the beginning of the semester, 5 of you will get A's, 15 of you will get B's, 10 of you will get C's, and the rest will fail. Like I'm determining ahead of time, even if all of you do almost barely as well as one another, and don't perform very, very well, then I'm going to fail some. That's how the bar works, and the reason is, again, they don't want the competition of there being other lawyers in the marketplace, so they limit it in that way. Another kind of service that's similar to this is telephone lines. Telephone lines are interesting, actually. I didn't know this until I actually did some work in the industry. Telephone lines are interesting. Now you're like, telephone lines, what's that? Those are the wires that people used to use to call one another on landlines. Now I guess they have cable TV wires on those, and you use your internet through those wires. Okay. When the infrastructure was being developed, though, the question was, who gets a phone? Now, phone networks were not national to begin with, they were local. So you lived in a city, and the telephone company would come in and build wires amongst all the houses within the city, right? Okay, and connect the city. Now you got to decide whether or not you had a wire run to your house. And the city could earn, or the telephone company would earn money at a competitive rate by connecting each of these houses to one another. But what if you lived over here, outside of town? Right? For the phone company, the fixed costs of running that wire to your house outside of town were very, very, very high. So high that they would be prohibitively expensive if they tried to charge the customer for those fixed costs. So these wires were never run under those circumstances. Well, and part of the reason is that there are multiple phone companies within a city that are competing with one another, competing and pushing the prices of phone service down within the city. Well, what the city would do is they would grant only one firm a monopoly to providing telephone service to that city under the requirement that that service also connect certain outlying homes. Well, why does the city care if the outlying homes are connected? Yeah.
City officials might live out there?
The city officials themselves might live out there, or at least one of their voters, one of their major contributors might live out there, right? And so these folks want to get connected. Talk about like the cable TV era. These people want their MTV, right? And so there's an incentive to grant a franchise to a large area where there's a monopolist, and the monopolist, instead of charging marginal costs to all the houses that are in the area, can now charge average costs. Not just average amongst the houses that are within the city, but average including the high fixed costs that are involved in connecting the outlying areas. Are you starting to see how this works? Okay, so is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's a normative question, right? But we understand that including a political economy perspective and thinking about the incentives that are faced by the people who are making the decisions, right, means that you're going to grant the franchise so that you can get this outlying facility serviced. And now the same thing is happening with internet. I actually read somewhere yesterday that, this group of politicians, was able to get high-speed internet to people in rural areas. Okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe people in rural areas are really glad to have that. but they're definitely getting it at a subsidized rate. And you have to ask yourselves, well, who's paying the difference? You are, right? Those who are living in a more concentrated area are paying the difference. So we see how a structure might emerge that causes monopoly, and that might be sustainable and even preferable from a democratic point of view if everybody in discussion about this says, yeah, that's what we want. Whether there was an actual conversation about that, I doubt it. Okay. Wherever you see licensing laws, you're talking about a closed monopoly. So who is on the licensing board? Generally, for any industry, if there's a licensing board, at least 2/3 of the people who are on that board are people who are already in the profession. Plumbers and electricians are in this category as well. Some licensing boards face a very serious conflict of interests, and that leads to negative effects for customers. Very seldom do you see consumers demanding licensing laws. Usually it's people that are already incumbents in the industry that demand the licensing law. Yeah, a few years ago in Washington, D.C., they passed a law requiring everybody who works at daycare facilities to at least have an associate's degree. And they didn't say what you had to have the associate's degree in. Now, do we want our children to be cared for by intelligent people? Sure. But should somebody have to go, if a person is already intelligent, should they have to go get an associate's degree to continue to work in childcare? Generally, this crowded out all of those aunties and grandmas who are taking care of a few kids for money at their homes for a little extra cash. And it crowded out those people who could not pay a very high amount for childcare. In other words, who does it harm? The marginal consumer and the marginal provider, who will tend to be both low cost or low paying participants in the market. Licensing tends to have what I call the Cadillac effect. I think others have called it that as well. The idea is if you make the regulations for automobiles be very, very strict, it moves towards a position where everybody has to drive a Cadillac, or at least a very high quality car. If everybody has to drive a very high quality car, who does that benefit and who does that harm? Well, it doesn't affect people who already have Cadillacs, but for those who cannot afford a Cadillac, it means that they don't get to have a car at all. And some people are willing to accept a low-cost option. There's a mother, maybe I've already told the story this semester, a mother who had a house in a low rent district of the city. Very low rent, not a great facility, dirty, and the super didn't take good care of the facility at all. But this woman was living there with her daughter, and she was paying for private piano lessons for her daughter because her daughter had shown some talent in this. And so she chose to continue to live in this not the best housing situation so that she could afford piano lessons for her daughter because she thought that her daughter might someday be a concert pianist. By requiring housing to be of a certain quality, you push the rents up. And pushing the rents up would crowd out the opportunity for that mother to spend that money on the piano lessons for her daughter. We foreclose upon other opportunities when we require a certain quality. Now, who benefits? Probably landlords are going to actually end up being the ones who benefit the most out of a rule like that. Okay. If you have an occupational law, you might only have A-class electricians in the market. But you don't need somebody who can wire a new skyscraper to come and install your new ceiling fan. The way that we articulate this is to say that there is an optimal quantity of low quality products and services. There is an optimal quantity of low quality products and services. Where licensing laws for electricians are strictest, we see more fires. Why might that be the case? Yeah,
It's harder to get a license, so then there's less people to put out those fires.
okay, but why did the fires start in the first place? If it's harder to get a license, there will be fewer licensed individuals. If there are fewer licensed individuals, then they will charge more for their services. If they're charging more for their services, what might you do? Yes,
Go with someone under the table.
under the table, or you might try to do it yourself. Right? Anybody ever install a ceiling fan? It's a pain in the butt, isn't it? Right? It's a pain in the butt. So when people do it themselves, they do it poorly. And as a result, there's more fires. Where licensing laws are stricter, the do-it-yourself stores are more plentiful and have higher profits. Right? But there's also more fires. Consumers end up being way worse off in general. It's worthwhile to focus for a moment on the peculiar perspective of the economist. High prices are not the problem. We're not worried only about high prices. What we're most concerned about is the loss of gains from trade. Our goal is to maximize surpluses. We want to always remember, consumer surplus and producer surplus, we always want to remember that the goal is to preserve as many surpluses as you can. As we move into talking about the monopoly model, we have a demand curve. And then the dominant, or the most interesting point about the monopoly model is that we also have a marginal revenue curve. And given marginal costs, right, the monopolist chooses to produce at a lower level of output than a competitive firm would, and at a higher price. The main difference is right, that the surpluses that could have been distributed from a competitive activity do not obtain. Those surpluses are lost. The monopolist will choose to produce at the profit maximizing point, which is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That means the monopolist reduces his output. As a result of the reduced output, the monopolist can choose to price at the consumer's full willingness to pay, or at least the marginal consumer's full willingness to pay. And the monopolist raises the price up to the point on the demand curve that correlates with that restricted quantity. This then gives the monopolist additional profits, or what we actually would call monopoly rents. Those extra profits are often what get identified as the evil, but the rents, profits, are not the only evil. It's not evil because the firm is earning profits. Let's put it that way. It's not evil because the firm is earning profits. From the welfare point of view, the evil is that there are lost gains from trade, from the potential from competition. Now, the fact that those profits are in part rents is an additional evil. It's not because the firm is earning the profits, it's because the firm expends resources to capture those profits. So even the profits that they do get cost them something, and it's a waste of activity. The extra profits have to be used somewhere. Often the firm is going to reinvest those profits elsewhere in its own firm or in the economy, or the firm may increase dividends to its shareholders, or it might use monopoly profits to bribe politicians. That can be a real evil, but then the politicians have to spend the money too. Perhaps some people spend some of the money on luxury goods, and as a result, fewer resources than usual go to the staples necessary to support the poor. That can be bad. But in general, the real evil is that the economist sees when looking at the monopoly is the deadweight losses that the monopoly creates. We can draw a more simple kind of monopoly model with a flat cost curve. This helps us to see things a little bit more simply. That marginal revenue, marginal cost will intersect here. The quantity gets chosen based upon the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. The price gets chosen based upon where the demand curve intersects with that quantity. This then is the profit rents that emerge from it. But what the economists notice is more than anything else are these deadweight losses. The extra profits that the monopolist earns are not quite as troubling because that's merely an issue of redistribution. I do worry about this a bit as a political economist, but an economist, quasi-economist, we don't care about the distribution problems, we care about efficiency. And monopoly is bad because it's inefficient. It's bad for all the political economy reasons too, but we don't even have to get into those more controversial topics to prove that monopoly is harming somebody in the marketplace. Questions? Okay. Now, what's harmful about the profits? This is an issue, again, of political economy that arises out of monopoly, which is how monopoly profits, those monopoly profits might influence the political sector. Right, this is a matter of institutional structure, of the constitutional limits on the activities of the organs of the state, and not a problem of the economics of monopoly, strictly speaking. So perhaps the greatest source of waste in the political economy is when more than one monopolist is trying to get the favor of the politician. So multiple different potential monopolists will bribe politicians. That corrupts the political sector. A very strong argument can be made, and has been made to some extent, that the complaints that many people lay at the feet of capitalists or entrepreneurs, those complaints are better laid at the feet of politicians, or at your own feet, for not paying attention to what's happening in politics and advocating for more constrained activities on the part of politicians. For example, if politics were impervious to corruption, if the political sector could not be corrupted, if the kinds of decisions that were within the scope of the politician to make could not grant any favors to any businessman, then we would not have a problem. If the scope of political action were so constrained that no political favors, such as subsidies or government charters for monopoly, or tax breaks to some but not to others, or bids for work contracts that the county commissioner's brother-in-law always seems to get. If capitalists could not spend money buying political favors, then they would either have to spend that money somewhere else in the economy, or they'd have to invest it somewhere else, thus increasing the productivity of other sectors of the economy. It's because the political sector is vulnerable to corruption that monopoly really becomes a serious problem. The first thing we have to notice about the monopoly model is that a monopolist will choose to produce the quantity that it produces, not based off of a flat marginal revenue demand curve that faces the competitive firm. Instead, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve. And as a result, it faces a full schedule of different marginal revenues. This is the simplest model of a monopoly. Okay. Now, a more complicated model would include all of the curves that we've looked at before. So we would have a downward sloping demand curve. We would have the marginal revenue curve. And in this case, the demand curve would be equal to average revenue. But we would also have a marginal cost curve. It's upward sloping. And then we would also have an average variable cost curve, and an average total cost curve. Now look at this graph for a second. What do you see? The quantity that this firm in this particular graph is going to produce is chosen by the price searcher at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. At this quantity, if the firm were to charge its marginal cost, what would we say about this firm? Is it earning profits?
No,
No, it's suffering losses. Why?
it's not charging the right price.
The right price? It's charging the right price if it's charging where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's not able to cover its total costs. At that price, the firm is not able to cover its total costs. So then, at that quantity, right, that's the losses per unit that this firm is suffering. So even as a monopolist, the only firm in the marketplace, right, this firm could not exist. This market would not exist if the firm were required to charge at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The firm and the industry would not exist. The industry wouldn't exist because we've assumed that the monopoly is a monopoly. It's the only firm in the industry. So then, this is not where the monopolist would choose to price. They would choose to price here. What if this were a regulated monopoly? As a regulator, what price might we regulate this monopolist to charge? Now, we don't want to break this firm up because we're going to assume that it's operating within the realm of increasing returns to scale. So to break it up would cost everybody more. This is the low cost provider of this good or service. So we want this industry to exist. Why do we want this industry to exist? That's a bigger question, actually. Right? A regulator might get involved and regulate this industry, right, if they want the industry to exist. That again comes out of the political sphere. Okay? This industry could die for all I care. This product does not need to exist. It can get dead. Okay? It's just a firm. I don't care. Unless there's a lot of people that want this thing. And they demand it. And they're even willing to get involved with politicians to try to get it. At that point, we might end up with a regulated industry, and the regulator will typically require that the firm only charge its average total costs so that it's only earning normal profits. It might allow a little bit more than that, but in general, it will tend to produce where the regulator will aim to have the monopolist charge where it's earning normal profits. And it'll tell it, the monopolist, that it has to lower or raise its prices based upon that. So this is in part how utilities are regulated. And of course, there's a lot of cost that goes into regulating and monitoring this behavior. How we're at the case where we're talking about the expansion of smart meters in Texas, when smart meters were first rolling out for electricity. You get a meter on the side of the building that measures how much electricity you're using, and they're developing these smart meters that would communicate via Wi-Fi or radio signal the actual use of that home in order to charge them. It's interesting. early on, they were only radio signals, and so they would actually drive a truck through each neighborhood in order to have the radio signal communicate to a computer on the truck how much electricity each person is using. They drive through every neighborhood once a month to collect this information. Then they started using internet on them. Now, the electricity is a regulated industry. So the local electric company wanted to expand and introduce smart meters, but that was going to be very costly, right? And so it would be very complicated, but they also were hoping that it would increase the demand for electricity and for electrical services. Now, if it's a regulated industry, why would they care about whether or not they're offering a great service? Why would they want to get involved? Maybe through political pressure. But as far as the firm goes, it's only allowed to earn normal profits. So why would it care? It's going to earn normal profits no matter what. Well, the CEO of the utility is paid based upon the overall flow of revenues into the firm. So the CEO of the firm would like to see the revenues of the firm be greater, even if profits for the firm don't change, because the CEO gets paid more. So the CEO will lobby, right? Or the other board members who are paid based upon the revenues of the firm, they're going to lobby to have something introduced that maybe isn't even worth introducing, because it's benefiting them. You kind of got to dig down in order to get to some of these results. So briefly, we want to talk about the elasticity of the demand curve here. I think I did that last time when we talked about total revenue curve. Elasticity. We saw situations where a firm might experience windfall profits in the short run. If they find a new innovation, they're able to have lower cost ways of producing. In the case of a monopolist, there's no windfall. The profits are ongoing because there are barriers to entry by competitors. And monopolists don't always earn profits. We could actually draw a monopoly graph where the average variable costs are somewhere like here, and average total costs are up here. This is even a stronger argument for the last story than the previous graph, right? Because there's no reason, right? There's no reason for this firm to exist at all. The average total costs are above the demand for that good or service. Well, what happens in a situation like this? We might be able to get production of some goods, but even if we price for marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we're still not able to earn a profit. If there is political motivation for this industry to exist, what must be the case in order for it to come to exist? Where's that difference going to come from? Yeah.
Subsidies.
Subsidies. Yeah. So oftentimes we observe a natural monopoly that is a franchise through the government of some sort, and it seems to be relatively inefficient, and that's because it is. But for some political reason, we want it to exist, and so it's subsidized. Where does the money to pay subsidies come from? Whence subsidies? Where does the money to pay for a subsidy come from? Yeah.
Be like taxpayer dollars?
Yeah, a lot of times I'll ask that question and students will say the government. Okay. Take it another step further though, right? Where does the government get money? Who just prints it? Okay, modern monetary theorist, thank you for playing. No. Right. Try again. Where does the money to pay a subsidy come from? It comes from taxes. What do we know about taxes? You remember how to draw the graph for a tax? Draw the graph for a tax. Okay, so suppose I say that in the market for shoes, right, supply is relatively inelastic and demand is relatively elastic. And then there is a tax, a per unit tax imposed. Let's call it, $10 tax. How do you draw that? We say the supply is inelastic. Inelastic is relatively up and downy. Demand is relatively side to sidey. Which side of the market should I impose the tax on? If it's shoes, I'm most likely to impose the tax on the supply side. I leave it to the student to reason out why. Okay. So I'm most likely to impose the tax on the supply side, fine. And impose a tax here. What happens as a result? Well, the price that the buyer pays is higher than it was before. The price that the seller gets is lower than it was before. And in the meantime, an entire region of deadweight losses is created while this region is collected as tax revenue. But every tax, unless there is perfectly inelastic supply or demand, every tax generates deadweight losses. So not only is a subsidy harmful because it is encouraging the supply of something that would not be provided by the market, but it's also harmful because it had to be paid for something that generated deadweight losses somewhere along the line. We can't forget that those deadweight losses are out there somewhere. If we go back to this graph, a monopolist with high costs would produce at this quantity because it's above the average variable costs, but it can only price as high as the demand curve. In the short run, this monopolist will continue to produce so as to cut its losses, hoping that demand will increase at some point. Or some monopolies are subsidized to cover some losses. For example, in Washington, D.C., the metro runs at a loss. And even worse recently than in the past. Because of COVID, nobody's been riding the supply or the metro. Okay. But the subsidy is considered a public good, and so the prices that the metro can charge are regulated so as to not earn a profit. Also, a monopolist does not always profit from raising its price. A monopolist would not choose, to go back to the earlier monopoly model, this monopolist would not choose to charge a higher price. Because in so doing, he moves up its average total cost curve higher, and the difference between the profits earned here and the profits earned here is a negative change. If we're moving up the elastic portion of the demand curve, revenues are going down. The highest total revenue point on any demand curve is the unit elastic portion of the demand curve. What else can we say? We might talk a little bit about cartels and collusion. Let me first walk through an equation related to elasticity. Can I do this right now? Do I have enough notes to do this? I don't think I do actually. I'm very short on time. All right, we'll start a short conversation of cartels now. Cartels and collusions. Adam Smith famously said, seldom do men of industry gather together for diversion or talk, but that the conversation turns towards ways to collude against the public. Seldom do men of a particular industry ever get together except that they turn towards a way, they try to discover ways to earn higher profits by colluding together. People seek to close the market to competitors in a variety of ways so that they can get a higher price or sell larger quantities. There's three ways that cartels form. One is predatory action against one's rivals. That would be to sell goods below the cost of production so as to bankrupt your rivals. And then afterwards, when they're gone, you raise your prices. The second is to collude with your rivals so that everybody reduces their output and raises their prices. This would reduce competition. You don't always have to remove the competition. Sometimes you can just change the form of the competition. And then the third approach would be to use a statutory closing of the markets, basically use the law. We'll go over these more next time. Thank you. Any last minute questions? Did somebody bring news for today? Somebody's supposed to bring news about what's going on in markets today. Is Emily coming here? Can you hand me this? Okay. That'll be all. Thank you.